Yes, I think by the end of my welcome, hopefully everybody is online because the most important are the speakers. So definitely, I would like to say, and because I almost always forget to do this, I'm going to introduce myself if you do not know who I am. So I am Anita Oberholster. I am the Cooperative Extension Specialist in Enology, based at the University of California, Davis. So I'm actually in the Department of Viticulture Enology, and I'm a part of a team of people called the Extension Coordination Committee that arranges extension and continued education programs on and off campus. So welcome to our new virtual on-campus workshop series. So this is actually our first wine focus on-campus virtual event for the year. So a special thank you for joining us today. As we realize that COVID-related safety restrictions are going to be with us for a while, we started contemplating the kind of programs that will work well on a virtual platform. And Karen Block and myself have been thinking about winery regulations type workshop for a while. And the timing seemed ideal, especially with the added regulations due to wildfire smoke and COVID-19. So we have an excellent lineup of speakers for you today. We're addressing the 4 cornerstones of winery regulations, and we fully realized that we could potentially do a day-long program on each of these topics. So as this may become a recurring topic, please complete the survey at the end of this program and let us know what you want differently or would have liked more information about, and we can use that to fine-tune any follow-up programs. We are really lucky today to have the top experts in each of these fields to share their knowledge with you today. And I hope this morning will be very informative and that there will be plenty for you to take back to your workplace and have some action items. So our Industry Relations Manager, Dr. Karen Block, will be our main moderator today, with myself and Caroline Furman, our program representative, as support. Karen will also introduce each speaker before they present. And as a reminder, please type any questions you may have in the Q&A. As the speakers are presenting, please type your questions when it comes up to you. We will address as many questions as we can. And those that we can't, the speakers have agreed to actually type them in for you after their presentation time. Now I'm going to hand it over to Karen Blanc. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you for all of the discussions that we've had about this and advice. And thank you all to Caroline Furman for helping with all logistics and registration and setting up the Zoom webinar itself. I also want to thank all of our speakers for taking the time to be here today and for presenting for you guys. They have a lot of really good information, which we all look forward to. And I also want to thank our extension partners. We would not be able to do programs like this without their support. So, and all of you in the audience or attendees today, thank you all for joining us today. Anita has already talked to you about making sure that if you have questions to please put them in the Q&A. Do not put them in the chat because it's much harder for us to then get them and answer it, make sure everybody sees it. So again, use the Q&A feature of the webinar. And so we are going to get started here. Our first speaker today is Mary Karani. She is the Wine Trade and Technical Advisor at the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, which is the TTB. She has a BS in chemistry from St. Mary's College here in California. And prior to working at the TTB, she actually worked at Concannon Vineyard for 10 years, both as a chemist and as a winemaker. In her capacity as the Wine Trade and Technical Advisor, she advises both the government and the industry on technical winemaking issues. She's a member of the TTB International Affairs Division and is an active participant in negotiating trade agreements covering wine. So Mary, thank you for being here today. And if you'll bear with me, I am going to share my screen. I'm going to mute myself and stop my video for everyone, but I'm going to share my screen as I have Mary's.
Good morning, everybody. As Karen mentioned, I'll be giving an update on TTB wine regulations. Next. Our TTB disclaimer. This information is being presented to help the public understand and comply with the laws and regulations that TTB administers. It is not intended to establish any new or change any existing definitions, interpretations, standards, or procedures regarding these laws and regulations. And in addition, this presentation may be made obsolete by changes in laws and regulations. Start off here with your local contacts for TTB. Jacob Goldman takes care of Sacramento South, sorry. So all the way down to the Mexican border. Teresa Knapp takes care of Napa, Sonoma, and up to the Canadian border and Alaska and Hawaii. And then my contact information also. So just a brief overview of TTB's responsibilities. First is to protect the public. And of course, the first T in TTB is for tax. So we want to collect the tax that's rightly due. We represent the US government and industry concerns and negotiations of free trade agreements dealing with alcohol beverages. And we represent the government and industry concerns at the Codex Alimentarius committee meetings. Codex Alimentarius is a joint World Health Organization and Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. And it's to set international standards for foods in general, but it also gets into veterinary medicines and things like that. And I have a slide later on the committees that I sit on. We certify laboratories for export analysis for those countries that require a laboratory analysis for imports. And we are there to make sure that only qualified individuals actually enter the alcohol industry. We, of course, approve formulas and labels, and that's pre-approvals. We monitor advertising, and that includes social media. We approve AVAs, American Viticultural Areas. We have an approved list of wine grape variety names for domestic labels. And we approve treating materials and processes after they've gone through FDA approval. And lastly, one of our main things is to enforce FDA's limits for additives, contaminants, and the use of colors. To make everyone's life easier, we have now a list of over 30 allowable changes that you can make to your wine labels without having to get a new COLA. And one of the biggest ones that the industry was the most happy with was you used to have a COLA for a wine that was under 14%, 14% or under, and then another COLA for if that wine actually was over 14%. Now, your label has to have the correct tax class, but your COLA can be in one tax class or the other. You don't need a COLA for each and every tax class. And this was brought around by discussions we had with wine industry trade groups. And we have a list of the allowable changes, and it's on our website, and here's the link to that. The rulemaking process, anybody, an industry member, an association, anybody that's interested can petition to have new viticultural areas, grape names added, or to have the regulations changed. We do limit the petitions for new treating materials and processes to permittees. We don't allow petitions from the actual chemical manufacturers. And this is because we want to make sure that once we go through rulemaking for these new treating materials or processes, that the industry is actually interested in using these. So TTB could introduce new regulations. We do that, especially if there are law changes. The process is once we get the petition, we do a notice of proposed rulemaking. It's posted in the Federal Register. There's usually a 30 to 90 day comment period. And then we issue a final ruling, which comes out as a Treasury decision, since TTB is part of the Department of Treasury. So for new treating materials and processes, the first step is the manufacturer must get FDA approval for all materials that come in contact with the juice or the wine or alcoholic beverages in general. So some treating materials are just for the wine industry, others are for alcohol in general. Then the winery will write a letter to TTB asking to experiment with the new treating material or process. And in that letter, it will say what size of experiment you want to do, the wine, the vintage, what you want to do, how much of the treating material you're going to add, a statement that the wine will not be released for commercial sale without approval from TTB, and that you will submit samples before treatment and after treatment to the TTB lab for evaluation. So we had a change in our the way that we're doing things. The experimental approval process is under 27 CFR 24.249. The ongoing use of that is under 27 CFR 24.250. We have now on our website, if you go to the wine tab and then treating materials, it lists all of the treating materials that are approved, administratively approved under 24.250, but are awaiting the actual rulemaking to be moved to 24.246 or 248. We did a notice of proposed rulemaking in 2017 to add all of the treating materials that were on the website at that time into 24.246 or 248. We received lots of comments to extend it, the comment period, and the final comment period ended April 9th, 2018. We are currently in review of the comments. We had over 1,000 comments, and we have drafted a rulemaking, and it's undergoing approval for final Treasury decision. Another rulemaking project was the modernization of the labeling and advertising regulations for all three commodities. And the idea was to try to align each of the commodities, parts 4, 5, and 7, so that if you know that the standards of identity for wine are in part 4 and it's in 4.21, when you go to distilled spirits and malt beverage labeling sections, the standards of identity will also be in part 21. So it was to make it easier going from commodity to commodity. As you can imagine, this was a huge task. The notice itself was over 900 pages. So we decided that we would not try to do one Treasury decision to cover all three commodities. So we did phase 1, and Treasury Decision 158 was posted on April 13th of 2020. And we will be coming out with another phase later this year, and possibly a third phase sometime next year. We dealt with distilled spirits first because it had the least controversy with that. Standards of fill. Treasury Decision 165 was issued at the end of December of 2020, and it was effective immediately. For wines, we added 3 more standards of fill, 200, 250, and 355. If you're interested in additional sizes, you can petition, but we will need to engage in additional rulemaking in order to add those sizes. Notice 160 deals with wine labeling and record keeping for those labels that were approved as an exemption from label approval, which means that they're sold in only one state. This is for standard grape wines that are at least 7% alcohol by volume. It used to be that if you got a certificate of exemption, you didn't have to meet all of the standards in Part 4 for labeling. And the standards that you didn't have to comply with were vintage, varietal, and appellation of origin, the percentages. We got a petition from the Napa Valley Vintners Association saying they didn't want Napa Valley grapes to be sent to a non-contiguous state and be able to still use the term Napa Valley. We put it out for comment. As you can imagine, there were two sides to the story. There were a lot of growers that said that, well, if you won't allow them to use our appellation, they're not going to buy our grapes. So this is still under internal review on whether we're going to reissue the notice with some changes to it. A little bit on the Bioterrorism Act. This is an FDA requirement. So even though you have to keep records for TTB, you also have to keep records for FDA, and you have to register the food facilities, prior notice of importation, establish maintenance of records, and then FDA has the administrative authority for the detention of food. And you can get more information on the FDA website. I'm going to very briefly introduce FSMA. It's the Food Safety Modernization Act, but Linda will be discussing this in much more detail later. Next. Okay, the Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act. It was signed into law in end of December 2017. It had a sunset clause. It was only good for 2 years. At the end of 2019, it was extended for 1 more year to the end of 2020. And it became permanent on December 27th, 2020. We will be coming out with new guidance on this, and we'll be changing our regulations because it is now a permanent law. And one of the technical corrections that was made in the extension to 2020 was you couldn't transfer your tax credit to a BWC, because the law as it was written at the first time said wine of your own production that you taxably remove. That has now been changed so that you can transfer your credit, your tax credit, to a BWC. And you can get more information on the TTB website. We have a long list of Q&As on that dealing with the different commodities. And we will be updating that and issuing new guidance. But we've been fairly busy for the last couple of months, so it is coming. Next. For production, that's produced by fermentation, produced by sweetening, produced by addition of wine spirits, amelioration for those states that allow amelioration, formula wine production, and with the new law, it also includes the production of sparkling or carbonated wines. Next. This slide is a little hard to see, but it is on our website. And the first section is still wines. So you can see that there are various tax classes depending on, this is taxable removals, not production levels. The next section is for carbonated wines. The next section is for sparkling wines, and the last section is for hard cider. Next. And if you need a definition of hard cider, it was changed in 2017. It is wines that are from apples or pears. It cannot have any other fruits in there. The alcohol content is lower than 8.5%. That's a change. It used to be 7. And the carbon dioxide level can be up to 6.4 grams per liter. And it still will be taxed at the hard cider tax rate. So I'm now going to go into a few international issues. In 2004, the Miscellaneous Trade and Technical Corrections Act became law, and it changed part of the Internal Revenue Code relating to cellar treatment of natural wine. Imported wines produced after December 31st of 2004 must now be certified by the government of the producing country that the practices and procedures used to produce the wine constitute proper cellar treatment in the United States and be affirmed with a laboratory analysis. Now, for this act, this only deals with natural wine, and natural wine for TTB and the Department of Treasury is fruit wine. So it doesn't cover agricultural wines such as sakis. Next. So of course there's an exemption. If there's a law, there's an exemption. If a producing country has a winemaking practice and procedure agreement with the US, they're exempted from this certification. And so far, there are 3 major sets of countries that have agreements. There's the World Wine Trade Group, which I'll get into in a couple of slides. That's the first bullet. The European Union, second bullet. And then the UK signed a continuity agreement at the end of 2019, or early 2019, so that once Brexit happened, free trade could continue between the countries. So the World Wine Trade Group, there's 9 countries. We have various agreements that have been signed by not all of the participants, but most. The Mutual Acceptance Agreement for Winemaking Practices, and this is the agreement from 2001, which exempts the WWTG countries from having to have that natural wine certificate. In 2007, we negotiated a labeling agreement, which allows for common mandatory labels to be used on all imports and exports among the countries. And the 4 common mandatories are alcohol content, country of origin, net content, and product name. And as long as those 4 are on any one label, it meets the national mandatories for labeling. We have a memorandum of understanding with on certification requirements, that we won't require certificates from the individual members. We have a labeling protocol from 2013. TTB will be doing some labeling changes in our regulations, and that's also part of the rewrites of parts 4, 5, and 7. And then we have an agreement on information exchange, technical cooperation, and dealing with possible counterfeiting measures. And that's from 2017. Uruguay is the newest member to the group, but in 2019, after they had signed the MAA, they said they wanted to have an export certificate to state that no exogenous water was used in grape wine production. The WWTG members all got together and tried to get an exemption from this, because we pointed out that water is used in wine production for rehydration of yeast, for lowering the Brix levels of high Brix juice, and for slurry preparations for treating materials. The US was able to get an exemption from Uruguay, so that we don't have to do this certificate, and a copy of the exemption in both Spanish and English is on TTB's export certification webpage. Sorry. In 2005, we initialed an agreement with the EU, signed in 2006, and it dealt with winemaking practices, both present and future, EU protection of appellations of origin, the US recognition of appellations of origin, the use of semi-generic terms, a simplified export certificate for exports to the EU, and a protocol on labeling of US wines for sale in the EU. Next. For those that don't know, here's the semi-generic names that are part of the agreement. The only semi-generic that is allowed in the US that's not part of the agreement is Angelica, because that is an American name. We put in Retsina because it's treated the same as the semi-generics in Europe, and we didn't have any colas for American Retsina, so we allowed that to be part of this agreement. And any colas that were issued prior to March 10th, 2006, which was the date of the signing of the agreement, are grandfathered. So if you had a cola from prior to 2006, you can continue to use the brand name or the brand name and the fanciful name. So you're grandfathered into the uses of the semi-generics. However, there are no new uses of the semi-generics. Next. So in 2006, the Tax Relief and Healthcare Act was passed, and there was a section that dealt with changing the legal status of the semi-generics to restrict their names to only Europe and or the grandfathered uses. Okay, Brexit happened, and as I said, we signed a continuity agreement that covered both distilled spirits and wine early in 2019. This was because the UK pulled out of the EU on January 31st of 2020, but the phase out of that pullout was until the end of 2020. So the continuity agreement entered into force on day one of Brexit, which was January 1st of 2021. It is based on the EU-US wine agreement, and we are negotiating a new US-UK agreement. But since the new trade representative hasn't been confirmed yet by Congress, things have slowed down on that front. The APEC Wine Regulatory Forum, APEC is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. There are 21 countries. Next. The value of the wine trade among the countries was 1.1 billion in 2000. It is now close to 70 billion in 2020. China is the biggest wine consumer in the Asian countries, and the consumption has more than doubled in the last 5 years. Non-tariff barriers, which is mostly wine certificates, were costing approximately $1 billion per year, and that's US dollars. And it was primarily due to unnecessary testing, testing that it didn't have salmonella, and duplicate and burdensome export certificates. Next. And this slide just shows how many duplicate certificates these countries were looking for. And most of them had the same information. But they wanted a certificate of origin and a certificate of conformity, a chemical analysis, a certificate of free sale. And so next, so we came up with a model wine certificate that would cover all of the required certificates. And this greatly cut down on the certificates because some of the countries were requiring up to 5 different certificates. This was not a something to say all countries need to require a certificate, but for those importing member countries that did require one, we asked them to use this model wine certificate so that one certificate would be filled out and not 5 different ones. Next. We also put together a regulatory compendia, and it has various parts. We have one on labeling requirements, one on compositional components, one on pesticide MRLs, and then we put together one on analytical methods because it came to light that different countries were using different methods, especially for sugar analysis. And so they were measuring very different components and was making importation into those countries very difficult. The compendia are all housed in FIBS Abridge. It's a pay-for service, but if you Google that, you'll be able to pull up that and see how to register for access to that. Next. So Codex, as I mentioned, is a joint World Health Organization and Food and Agricultural Organization. The 2 committees that I go to are the Committee on Food Additives and the Committee on Food Labeling. The Food Additives Committee has a general standard for food additives. All foods are broken down into 16 different categories. Alcohol beverages are in category 14. Alcohol is in 14.2. And right now, we only have the listed additives in the general standard. We're trying to get together with the European Union to see if we can get acidity regulators and that in there. But there's a difference of opinion between the US and the EU on that. The Food Labeling Committee, we've managed to exempt alcohol beverages from the requirement for date labeling. They're currently exempted from nutrition labeling, but that is up for discussion at the next meeting. And also the World Health Organization is trying to have international alcohol labeling standards to cut down on the misuse of alcohol beverages. And that is also going to be discussed at the next meeting, which is currently on the books as a virtual meeting at the beginning of September. The Committee on Food Additives is yet to be determined where that's going to be, but it would probably also be a virtual meeting, and that's at the end of September of this year. Both meetings were canceled last year. TTB does send a representative for the Committee on Contaminants in Food, and the alcohol issue that they're dealing with right now was to lower the approved level of lead in grape wine specifically. It was at 200 ppb. They wanted to lower it down to 50, but people were able to show the analysis saying that 150 ppb for fortified wines and 100 for non-fortified grape wines was much more appropriate, and that 50 was just way too low. So they have enacted that. They are starting to look at setting maximum lead levels for other alcohol beverages. And they are working on a code of practice on the prevention and reduction of lead contamination in foods in general. So a little bit about what I do. I give advice to the Bureau and the industry on technical winemaking questions. I'm the liaison with other government offices, FDA, EPA, USDA. I'm a member of the US negotiating team for bilateral and multilateral trade agreements that deal with wine, and a member of the US delegation to Codex. Next. A little bit about the outreach that TTB is doing right now. Everything is virtual, as it is with everybody else. We do give presentations at industry conferences. We give a talk or presentation at Unified at least once every other year. It's now seems to be a yearly thing. We go to other industry conferences. We gave a presentation at Oregon conference a couple of weeks ago. We do have booths at the trade shows. So this is Unified, CiderCon, craft beverage, and all of that. We've been doing a lot of webinars since we can't do in-person presentations. We have a new website where we are listing our presentation, so that if you didn't see the labeling presentation for the Oregon Grape Growers Association, you can pull that up. I know it was posted last week. We continue to update guidance on our website. We have a COVID page, a disaster relief page, Craft Beverage Modernization Act page. And on the COVID page, there is a list of contacts, how to contact us, since we're asking everybody to submit all of their requests, paperwork, all of that electronically, because we are all working from home, and so there's nobody in the office to actually see what's being sent in through mail. And to make things easier, we are developing a MyTTB system, which will allow you to have one username and one password for all of our electronic sites. So formulas online, permits online, and all of that. You'll just need one login and one password, and you'll be able to see all of the recent transactions for your account. So similar to online banking. And last, here's my contact information. If I don't get to your questions, please do email me. And here's my phone and fax. Thank you. Okay, a question. What do you think is the future of requiring nutrition labeling? That is something that is ongoing discussions. The biggest thing is what is an ingredient and what are nutrition labeling. The FDA has now come out with allowing, what do they call it? Traditional values for the menu labeling. And so TTB, if we decide to go through with nutrition labeling, we would certainly look at FDA's guidance.
Oh, looks like we have another question that came in. So.
Okay, with the Codex, we have a lot of sidebar negotiations in the meetings, and we try to come to a common agreement and then put it forward for the rest of the membership. There's over 160 countries in Codex. The biggest problem that we're having, or the biggest issue right now, is the EU wants numerical values for the acidity regulators, and the US wants to go with good manufacturing practice. And this is because a lot of the acidity regulators, as you know, are already in wine. And so if you put a numerical value on tartaric acid and say the maximum you can add is 4 grams per liter, but you didn't add any, but your wine already has 7 grams per liter, there is a possibility that when you export that wine to a non-producing country, they'll analyze it and say you have 7 grams per liter. The general standard says you can only add 4. They don't understand that there's already tartaric acid naturally occurring, and your shipment will be rejected. So we want to go with good manufacturing practice. The EU says we have numerical values in our regulations. We want to continue with those, but internally, yes, you can have that because the regulators can go and look at your books and say, oh, well, you didn't add any acid, so you're under, you're not part of this regulation. So we are having ongoing negotiations with the EU to try to get the wine category, the number of additives in the wine category up to a reasonable level. Since we changed the alcohol tax break to 16%, we'll change labeling match as well. No, the tax break at 16 is under the Internal Revenue Code. The tolerances for labeling are under the FAA Act, so they're in Part 4. So wines with 14% or under still have the 1.5%. Wines over 14 still only have plus or minus 1%. And this is addressed in one of the FAQs on our website.
Great, thank you.
Are there any issues with voluntary ingredient labeling, full versus partial disclosure? We do allow voluntary labeling, ingredient labeling. Since labels have to be truthful, accurate, and not misleading, we would require that it would be a full and not just a partial disclosure. And acidity regulators are things that regulate acidity. So tartaric acid, malic acid, lactic, deacidifiers, things like that. Can a wine producer's tax credit transfer to another bonded facility? Yes, they can. Reference comments, public. Yes, all the comments are available to the public. It's part of the comment period. We say that your comments will be posted on the portal, and everybody can see what your comments are. And we do take them from the public, from foreign governments, from industry, non-industry. Everybody is free to comment on any rulemaking that is done.
Right. I think that's it. Thank you very much, Mary, for speaking today. Really appreciate your being here.
You're quite welcome.
All right. Our next speaker is Jacob Applesmith. He is the Senior Counsel at Pillsbury, Winthrop, Schott, and Pittman. And thank you very much for being here today. He got his undergraduate degree at Middlebury College, his JD at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. He has served as a senior advisor to former California Governor Ed Brown. He was the former chief campus counsel for UC Davis. And more recently, he was the former director of California's Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control. At Pillsbury, he helps clients navigate California's complex regulatory agencies with respect to alcoholic beverages, cannabis, gaming, and state government processes. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'm really happy to be here. I have really enjoyed being a regulator over the years, and that you say that to people and they sort of wince. But I am very interested and always have been in helping to solve practical problems. And I have found that there are great government agencies and not so great government agencies. I would include the TTB in the great government agency. Now that I'm on the other side of the table, my contacts with them have been what I hope people's contacts have been with the ABC, which is really people who are very smart and technical and trying to help you solve problems. So I'm really happy to be here, and I will see if I can get my thing up here. Yes, I can. Okay. Real quick before I do that, though, I want to show you this. This is the badge that I used to have. And when I retired, they put it under glass so that I couldn't run around and impersonate a piece of it. But you'll see, let's see. Of course. Did I do this properly?
Looks good.
It does?
Yep. Okay,
very good. Let's see. Okay. It's not showing. Okay. Okay. Anyway, so there's my badge now that it's not under glass anymore. I'm going to give you some historical background on this. Please bear with me. I promise this won't devolve into too much of a Ken Burns documentary, but it is crucial for you to understand the context in which the regulations of alcohol work, why they are like they are. They are not very intuitive. In 1940, the Alcohol Beverage Control Act was literally about 1/8 of an inch thick, and now my volume of it is about 1 1/4 inches thick. That's just how complicated it has become, and it's for a variety of reasons I'll touch on as we go. But was there really beer on the Mayflower? And the answer to that is yes, because it was antimicrobial, safer to drink than water, and it was what's called a small beer, less than 1%. But the point being that alcohol was important to Americans even before they were Americans and arrived upon this shore. People drank a whole lot back then, right? I mean, it was just part of daily life. I'm a big Dickens fan, and little David Copperfield, 9 years old, walking around the streets of London, has ale with his lunch. Just a very different world than we have now in terms of the commonplace aspect of drinking. So again, Prohibition, alcohol was just viewed as a huge societal problem, and part of the perception of the problem was that there was a greedy industry controlled by foreign elements. I'm just telling you what people's perception was, not what may have actually occurred, but controlled by foreign elements that didn't care at all about communities and just poured cheap alcohol into them. And so part of Prohibition was a puritanical idea of whether people should drink and be intoxicated, but part of it also is general social reform and an anti-corporate greed reform, back of a better way to put it. So Prohibition, of course, has spawned all sorts of fabulous movies and other things. It really did not work, although coming out of it, I would say there were a lot of positive effects, a greater recognition of health. Certain types of alcohol abuse diseases like cirrhosis of the liver actually did notably decline. And then out of it also came for us an actual regulatory system. And that was, of course, the 21st Amendment. Anytime you see a bar called the 21st Amendment, it'll remind you of your history lesson in this. But in any event, so coming out of Prohibition, a unique aspect of our Constitution was created, which is that alcohol is the sole province of the states as long as it stays within the state. So the reason the TTB exists is because alcohol actually leaves states, there's interstate commerce, other things as well. But if you could imagine a state that could, in theory, like Texas has done with its power grid, wall itself off to try to avoid federal regulation. But it's just really not practical It's not desirable. And so we have these dueling is too negative, but there are two regulators, right? There's the state regulator and there is the TTB. And Ms. Mari did a great job and put it very well. They're primarily concerned with taxation, with health and safety issues, with issues that go beyond just the borders of the state. Whereas I would say with the ABC in California, much more concerned with local issues, with the effect of alcohol in communities, with the orderly conduct of commerce within the state. So in any event, one of the things that came out of all this, these laws were what are called tied house laws. And most people getting into the industry, when they find out all the things they can and cannot do, they curse the tied house laws, and they hate the tied house laws because the tied house laws prevent them from opening up a restaurant and only serving their own wine, for example, right? You can't do that. Well, you can at your winery, but I'll get to that. But anyway, so the tied house laws, essentially in their purest form, the industry is divided into producers, winemakers, distributors, Young's Market and Southern Glazers and all the others that tote around alcohol, and then the retailers, the ones who actually serve it. So that's in its purest form. And when it started in California, the ABC Act was so thin, physically thin, because it just says one tier cannot do anything else that another tier does. So a pure system would be, you'd produce your wine, you could not sell it to anyone who walked across your threshold except a distributor. And then that distributor could not sell it to anybody other than a retailer. And that would be a pure system. About as close of a place as you would see that would be in the state of Delaware. And even it has exceptions. But our exceptions go to the hundreds of pages. And the reason we need alcohol lawyers like myself. The ABC was created in 1955 as an outbreak of the taxing authority in California had a huge amount of corruption, and so this California Constitution was amended and it created the ABC to become the alcohol regulator. So in California, unlike the TTB, which does its own tied house regulation and investigative work, it's also the taxing authority. We are not. The ABC is separate from the Cal taxing authority. And that was partly created that way to avoid corruption, really. So today, alcohol humongously important in the state and to its economy. Look at the number of licensees. I mean, it's really phenomenal. Restaurants are really a driver of our economy, and the wineries are really the pride and joy of California. Of all the things, any sophisticated adult around the world would know about California. It would be California wine, and because of that, and it's obviously climate, it's tradition, but because of that, you have very unique privileges within the alcohol world. Just quick things about the ABC, which I used to run. It's all special funded, so that means that every single penny it spends is based upon the fees that you pay. There are peace officers, full-on peace officers, and they are doing a whole bunch of different kind of work. Fortunately for you, there's not a lot of need to do criminal investigations and administrative investigations in and around wineries. And that's just partly the nature of your businesses, people who patronize your businesses, just generally also the responsibility of your industry. Alcohol regulation at the state level is very local. That's why there are 24 statewide field offices. They are everywhere from Eureka to Palm Desert to San Diego. the most important one in the wine industry is the Napa office. There are lots of experts in that because they deal with it all the time. That expertise is growing in San Luis Obispo just because of the needs of the local operations. But again, alcohol regulation at the statewide level, very localized. When you apply for a license, an ABC employee comes out and looks at your establishment and does an investigation and inspection. There's a myriad, part of the complication of alcohol regulation in California is the myriad types of licenses. So there are licenses just for ships, right? There are licenses just for planes. There are licenses that pertain only to Disneyland. There's UC Davis now has a license because we're trying to avoid having to pour wine down the drain and rather sell some of the wine that they make in bulk to others, and just environmental consciousness and other things. But the licensing, there are about 80 different kinds of licenses. Most are, I would say, are captured within the different kinds of manufacturers and retailers and wholesalers, and that probably is, most of the licensees fall into about 15 categories. But it's not uncommon for a winery to have a type 02, which is your basic wine and growing license, to have a 17, which allows them to distribute other people's wines and their own, that would have a restaurant license, so that they can operate a restaurant away from their primary location and away from their duplicate tasting room. Again, huge economic impact. One of the reasons during COVID, there's been such aggressive efforts to try to allow businesses to keep operating and having people come in them is the importance of the industry to our economy as a whole. Okay. So the ABC is not the TTB and vice versa, and I don't say this with any negativity at all, but there seems to be confusion sometimes among people when saying, well, the TTB says I can do this, so I can do it in California. And so the answer to that is maybe or maybe not, right? Because the ABC can set and the state of California can set all sorts of rules that essentially are much stricter than what the TTB requires. Now, there's no conflict between them. And if you go, as you know, if you apply for a type 02 license, you need to have a federal permit. But you could get a federal permit and the ABC would not issue a license if it didn't view you as qualified, if it didn't view where your vineyard was as an appropriate place to run a winery, those sorts of things. So again, they are in parallel, and they have a unified interest at the end, but just keep in mind they are not the same and should not be confused. Very busy licensing practice with the ABC. Most winery operations, licensing operations are relatively straightforward just because of where your location is. You don't tend to impact neighborhoods. There doesn't tend to be the kinds of challenges of, say, putting a bar in the middle of a city or a restaurant in a residential neighborhood. Now, that's not to say that those don't exist, because they certainly do. And the ABC tries to work through those with you. And really my philosophy there was and continues to be the philosophy of the agency is we are here to help good people get into business and thrive. There are restrictions on what the ABC can and cannot do, but really we should be there to help you start and run your business and have that business flourish. Okay, you are special, and this has a long history to it, partly because of the pride California has in its wine industry, and also quite frankly because the wine industry has been very sophisticated and very politically savvy. And the example I always use of that is wine is generally thought of as food and is promoted as food and part of food, much more so than beer, and certainly much more so than distilled spirits. And so, and the individuals who have been in the wine industry have just been very good at helping the wine industry have privileges that really beer and distilled spirits especially do not. So I talked about the strict 3 tiers, right? But you are all 3 tiers with limits, right? But you can, as I'm sure you know, you can make your own wine. You can sell it to people who come into your tasting room, and they can drink it there and they can walk away with it. You can ship it to people this is all under your Type 02 license. You don't need a special permit for this. You can ship it to consumers around the state and around the globe. And around the country, as long as there's a reciprocal agreement with another state. You can run a restaurant at your winery, and at that restaurant, you can, if it's a full-on restaurant, you can serve beer and wine. You can own a liquor store that only operates as a wine and beer store, right? You can run a restaurant away from the premises, or if your spouse wants to own her own restaurant and run that restaurant, she or he can do that. And there's limits on it. There's limits on how much of your own wine you can sell there and things like that. But in general, you can do a whole lot of things that beer can do some of, but distilled spirits can do very, very little, right? And that's just, again, partly the nature, again, of the politics of it, and the fact that wine is much more viewed as an integral part of a healthy lifestyle and a food lifestyle. And it's your responsibility, I will submit to you, to continue that spirit and to continue to promote the responsibility of the wine industry, the sophistication of it, and the fact that it's part of a healthy lifestyle. I was just the other day reading a history of the homeless, and the homeless in California were originally called winos. Not good for the wine industry, right? Also a terrible thing to say about people with challenges with housing. But I say that because people don't really say that anymore, or if they say it now, it's actually sort of a compliment indicating that you like wine. You can have a second tasting room, I think, as probably most of you know. It's called a duplicate. Those are used very successfully in a lot of places. And a lot of times when you see multiple wineries together pouring rooms, it's because they're doing it as duplicates. Minors are allowed in your establishment, whether you're serving food there or not. So again, lots of privileges. There's lots of weird rules around all of this. And I'll just, weird is too strong of a term, because there generally is most of the time an explanation to it that actually has some solid policy behind it. And sometimes it's just because there was somebody's friend in the legislature did a favor for somebody else's friend somewhere. But just as an example, right? So if you're running your tasting room, you can sell for the people who come into it, they can walk off of the wine, but you're limited to 50% of the wine that you're actually producing at the site, right? And that's the idea, that the tasting room is really created to allow people to come see it, to experience what you do, and to you be able to sell wine to them, because it's kind of be odd if you couldn't. But the idea is you should be making wine there, not just using that as like a front for a giant manufacturing facility somewhere else. Okay, so just a little bit more on the ABC. Again, mostly they're not prowling around wineries, because there really doesn't need to be that, but they are full-on sworn peace officers with general police powers. Most of the time we try to walk around without our guns showing, but by policy, they all carry guns, just so you know. And again, the reason they carry guns is because they are in some pretty dangerous places. They're at bars, they're at large events, and they're dealing with people a lot of times who are under the influence of alcohol and other substances. So most of the arrests that we're doing relate to service to minors, but there are also a lot of ones for just sort of the bad restaurant or bar that is really hurting the town and hurting the neighborhood. They are trained to be industry partners. That is their version of community policing, so they should be there to help, not there to sort of sneak around and look to try to catch people things. We generally are try to get people to tell them how to comply. And just a good example, one I'm very proud of, as you know, in California, there's a lot of corner stores that are run by first and second generation people. And because they are somewhat new to our culture, they don't fully appreciate some of the rules and why we have them and how we work. As I like to say, if you just stuck me in the middle of, I don't know, Germany, I would not know how to run a business there because I'm not from there. I don't know what to expect. I don't know the culture. So what we try to do with those businesses is, instead of going in there and writing them up because they are selling things they shouldn't, like drug paraphernalia, or they have graffiti on their stores, which by law they're not allowed to have, to allow to continue. Instead, what we really try to do is say, hey, look, you can't do this and that. You got to cut this out. And by the way, you will be more successful if you do these things. It's not just something you got to do. It is something you got to do, but it's going to help you. And so that is something that they're really trained to do and should be doing. That's not to say we don't have people who can be jerks, because everyone has that. But that is their philosophy, and we're really trying to help the industry and prosper. Because of, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but a bad apple in your industry will cause you problems, all of you, no matter how good you can train. So there we are, just a variety of things. We do drug cases, we do gun cases. Alcohol is really viewed as a vice, just from a policing perspective. And although we don't talk about it so much like that anymore, it continues to be a case that alcohol and other substances and illegal activities do tend to trail around each other in certain kinds of establishments. So again, I kind of said this already, but generally, this is what we want to be, right? We want to be practical, proactive, and reasonable. And again, a shout out to the TTB, because I had never really dealt with the TTB at all the entire time I was a state regulator, because it just wasn't relevant to what I did. But I had an obscure question with cooking sake. And so I found a person at the TTB, and I wanted to know, did we have to, was it a cola we needed, or was it an FDA food label? And that one stumped them, by the way, but they came back with an answer, and they were fabulous. And that was them being proactive and reasonable and trying to help me. And they were really great. Then there's those who are prisoners of laws and lawyers, right? And those are the ones who just say, well, if you want to solve something, I have to go to a rule book, and I'm going to look up your answer in a rule, and I'm going to come up with an answer to your solution is going to be somewhere in a rule book. That is a terrible way to go. What we want to do is say, well, what is the right thing to do? How can we help this person now? Is there a rule or a regulation that will either help them or stop them? And then try to figure that out from there. And then finally, like I said, they're jerks. They're just plain jerks everywhere. But if you find a jerk at the ABC, please let the ABC know they have a jerk there, because maybe the person doesn't know they're a jerk, or maybe they just need to be sent to unjerk school or whatever we can do with them. But we can't get anywhere unless someone is telling us how we can do a better job. When I said generally Americans think alcohol regulation is about right. They recognize that it can be potentially very bad thing if it is not regulated and properly sold and responsibly sold. And there's just some of the kinds of issues that they have concern with. But generally, in places where people complain about regulation, alcohol, not so much. And I know there's probably people listening to me who run into regulatory obstacles they couldn't overcome. And so nothing is perfect and everything can be improved. But generally, alcohol regulation is a popular thing among the public. And you know what? Actually, among the industry too, because it protects you from danger. Danger, my friends, danger, undue regulation of wild new laws. The biggest danger of the alcohol industry's concerns, taxation, right? And it also protects you from unfair competition. So, so as many of you know, come later this summer, right? You're going to be required to have, I can't remember if they extended it a year, so don't quote me on this, but you're going to be required to have anyone serving in your tasting rooms to have a certification of responsible beverage service. And generally your industry does a really good job of that anyway without compulsion, but a law was passed that now requires this. And why was it passed? Because a Marine at Camp Pendleton, about 3 to 4 times the legal limit of alcohol, killed a bunch of medical students in a horrible, terrible, tragic car accident, right? And so maybe alcohol beverage servers training being required is a good thing. But that accident, the bartender tried to stop the guy from leaving. They tried to take his keys away from him. They did every single thing. He didn't get drunk at the place where they were trying to stop him. Everything that we would train you to do and to not serve drunk people and to try to get them to get a safe ride home, that bar did. And yet that incident was the catalyst for this. So again, the law is probably a good thing, but bad stories in the alcohol industry make bad law. Second, taxation, right? You are the lowest tax, about the lowest tax state of any excise tax in this country for wine. I can't remember if we're 49th or 50th, so really, really low for state taxes. But bad things happen in an industry and the state becomes desperate for money. Who are they going to tax? Are they going to tax kids for walking to school? No, they're going to go after what is perceived as a vice industry. So it's important to say, hey, we are heavily regulated. We are killing it for this economy. So don't put a bunch of crazy rules on us and don't tax us. And finally, unfair competition, especially important for small wineries, small alcohol producers. There's a lot of the rules are in place to prevent gigantic producers and distributors and retailers from essentially driving small people out of business. Now, there's still a lot of giant companies controlling a lot of them, and a lot of them, quite frankly, are my clients, right? But these are a lot of things we're seeing with unfair competition. And so giant retailers, for example, the tied house laws were originally aimed, I think I said as suppliers, but I would say it's kind of flipped a lot now. And they're retailers with such enormous economic power that they can demand things of suppliers and distributors. But they're only allowed to do so much because of tied house laws. One principle of the tied house law is that a supplier is not allowed to give anything of value to a retailer. So if someone says to you, oh, well, I'll put you on my shelves, but I want $100, that's a slotting fee and it's unlawful. And actually the TTB has done a really good job of taking some actions around the country on slotting fees. There are non-licensees who want to be in your business, right? So there's people who say, I want to sell your wine for you, but don't have licenses and shouldn't be doing that. But at the same time, there's increasing numbers of internet services and providers, for example, or delivery services who are all unlicensed, and they are trying to push the boundaries of what they can do without actually holding a license. And it creates challenges for you because it becomes more difficult to compete if your competitors down the street are using people who are not licensed to sell their wine who probably should be. A lot of this is sort of unknowing of people, but as it says in the last bullet point there, it's becoming increasingly the product of large, sophisticated entities that are trying to get around many of the tied house laws, which again have a public safety element to them, but really, I would say more importantly, for small wineries and breweries and craft distillers, very much of a fair competition development. So, a couple of things just to know about the ABC and things that are coming. The department has a non-retail licensing unit, which some of you may have already dealt with. You still generally go to or deal with a local office, at least on some level, because like, as I said, someone locally is going to have, if you're looking to expand your tasting room or you're looking at opening up a Dupo too, they're going to go out and look at it, and that just has to be done at the local level. But we created this over about the last year and a half, a non-retail licensing unit, because the questions are not sort of the normal traffic of most ABC offices, although I would say the Santa Rosa office and wine is an exception just because of the volume of it. So this was just designed to be much more efficient. They deal with tied house issues in terms of ownership. You know, if you have an investor, does that investor have to be qualified? And if that investor is also an investor in a chain of restaurants, they may not be permitted to invest in your winery. So they deal with things like tied house issues and non-retail licensing. Very specialized. It's really getting up and going, but it's fully staffed now, and we're hoping just to make things go a lot faster and get better results out of it. Third tasting room is something that has come up for several years now. I think it probably will get there eventually. This is essentially would allow you to have a second Dupo 2. So you have one at your winery and the 202s, the 2 Dupes you'd be able to have. Partly this was a function of some wineries operating with alternating proprietorships. They're not allowed, you know, because they're going under a master license, they're not allowed to have, just by contract, tasting privileges at the winery where they have the AP. And so this is an effort to allow them to have 2 tasting rooms somewhere. The types of pandemic regulatory relief, I mean, I don't want to go too far into this because most of you, I assume, have taken advantage of and figured out what those are. But essentially, they're mostly designed to just pull back from all rules unless there was just a hardcore public safety issue involved, just to allow people to be to eat and to drink and to live normal lives and to have you operate your businesses, but to do so in a safer way, right? So if any, you know, any of you been to a city recently, or probably even in some of your areas, you know, that just all of a sudden there's eating and drinking on the street that would probably not have been allowed before, or certainly would have taken many years to approve through all sorts of processes. At the ABC, we created something that says, look, if you come in and you tell us you have a right to be in that space and you can control that space, you are good to go. And then we'll deal with any problems on the back end. So instead of preventing a problem from happening, we assumed it would not happen, and then the deal with problems. And that has been enormously successful. These will continue as long as, I mean, I can't speak for the agency anymore, but my view is they will continue as long as the pandemic is a meaningful interrupter to the business. So let's hope they end, just because that'll mean that we're out of this terrible time. The only other thing I'll say about them is some of them may actually become permanent. I would say the liberalization of outdoor dining probably will, and other things that we've seen have really enhanced our lives separate and apart from just getting relief from the virus. Okay, some advice. I kind of touched on this, but really spend a little time on the front end. And the ABC and the TTB can really help you a lot with this. Just say, hey, look, this is what I want to do. How can I do it? They don't always have the answers. They're not entrepreneurs, but they really, if you're really trying to do something that is reasonable and responsible, they should be helping you to do it. You know, have a detailed plan of what that is. You know, really, what do you want to do? Because you may not be able to do it the way you really envisioned in the beginning, but you might be able to do it in a different way. And so we really try to help you solve these kinds of problems and figure out something you want to do. I mean, if you have a business that is reasonable and responsible and a good idea, well, let's just figure out a way to actually be able to do it for you. You know, and I, you know, consultants are excellent. There's a lot of really good ones, especially in the wine industry. You know, this association of people you're in. I mean, talk to each other, right? You know, or the Wine Institute is there to help you. But again, really emphasize, you know, think about what you want to do and think about what you want to do tomorrow, right? You know, so we'll sometimes have places where they just thought, well, I'm going to run a little tasting room. I don't really care about, you know, this dirt patch I have in between myself and you know, Highway 116 or wherever I am. Well, you should think about the dirt patch in the long term and think about how you may want to operate it one day, and maybe you just want to license that right now because you can. So anyway, again, I plan on the front end because you can save yourself a lot of trouble down the line. And then, of course, champagne. So I always say this, and it kind of brings us back to why we have regulations and the value of them for you. Champagne is I used to say it was the most expensive grape in the world, but that's probably not true anymore. There's certainly grapes in microclimates in the that have a higher price, and but it's right. So anyway, it is the most heavily regulated agricultural product in the world. You know, they limit how many vines you can harvest a year. They limit how many grapes you can take from a particular plant. They limit how long you can ferment to do something, or how long you can keep it in a bottle. They limit how much you can release in terms of bottles. It is just really unbelievable, and it's all supported by them because they are selling a brand, and they know the value of it, right? They also hunt down anybody who uses the term champagne other than the ones who are grandfathered in, as Marty said earlier, who are allowed. There's a few who are allowed to use it because they used it so much. But anyway, their point being that if we have an incredibly high quality product and we agree through a system of regulations to do this, we are going to thrive, and boy, do they thrive, right? And that's true of your industry. Not as regulated, probably doesn't need to be as regulated. But my point is, you know, regulation in your industry is going to be your value, right? In many respects, because it protects you from taxes and weird laws. It also, you know, if someone is making a bad wine, is that good for you? No, right? You know, someone puts their, you know, someone who just doesn't know anything, and, you know, I don't know, pick a place, drinks a bad California wine. Well, I'm never drinking wine from California again. Now that's a little bit over dramatic, I realize, but bad people in your industry are bad news for you. And I just really encourage you to be thoughtful about why we're regulating and how we can all succeed together, because it really is a fabulous industry, and we just always have to be vigilant and not sit on our laurels. And I think that is it. Yes.
All right, thank you, Jacob, very much. We do have some questions in the Q&A. The first one is, do you have to apply for a duplicate 02 license, or is it just a privilege of your original, is that an IO2 license or LO2?
You have to apply for it, but it is presumptively your right to have it.
Okay.
And once you have your O2, it's a lot less of a procedure, because they don't have to qualify the wine, the winery. It's a lot simpler because you already have an underlying license.
And then the next question someone has, how about micro wineries? I'm in the Bay Area and want to source grapes, make the wine using my own facility, and sell direct to consumer only through the internet. My understanding is that I need both a license 2 and the newer license 85. Is this correct? Also, do I need additional licenses to ship outside California?
I believe that it's an 82, not an 85. And you actually don't need an 82 if you're shipping only your own wine. You
Why does
you can do that under your O2. And in fact, I believe it's the case that there's not a single California winery that actually has an 82.
Why does the ABC require the fingerprints of spouses for O2 licenses, even when the spouse is not involved in the business?
Because the spouse has an ownership interest in the business. So the theory would be that we don't want shadow owners. We don't want anyone who has a legal authority to actually control the business to be an owner of that business. And I gave the example earlier of like a spouse would own a restaurant. So we had, for example, a situation where a couple, one owned a winery, one wanted to be in the distilled spirits distribution business, and that is not permitted. So even though they are entirely separate businesses, they agreed never to talk about each other. They could not be both licensed in those respective parts of the industry.
Is there a tied house issue with having a vineyard website connected to a non-retail entity website owned by the same company?
If I understand the question, the answer to that should be that's okay if you're operating the website yourself, although it does other things. The key with all of this is if you're having someone, a separate entity, or operate a website, or you're part of one of these websites that is essentially sending buyers to you, you need to be controlling the sale and making the sale and offering the sale. So some of these websites work by, you would go on the website, it's like, Vine Tech or whatever it is, and then you would click through, and you would never know you were leaving the Vine Tech website, but you're actually technically in a website that belongs to the winery itself. So as long as the winery continues to control who they sell to, what the price is, and all that, you're fine.
Can a winery or a brewer pour brand tastings at local restaurants or grocery stores?
You can do it at a local grocery store under the local grocery stores. I think it's a type 86 tasting permit, and you can do that there. And at restaurants, there are rules relating to that are enormously complicated. That is like a winemaker's dinner, where there's allowances for you to go to the restaurant and do this. The rules around it really relate to the promotion of the restaurant as opposed to the promotion of the event. But it's really called a winemaker's dinner.
So it's under the presumption that that would be like a one-time thing, or throughout the year or something like that.
Yeah, there are various limits on it. It's really allowing you to sort of have kind of like a one-time thing, but not be something where people start to associate your winery with that restaurant. That would be a classic tied house problem.
This is an interesting question. I'm not sure if this is for you or what resources are available for sugar tolerances for OTS and or carbonation tolerances for artificially carbonated wines and OTS.
I have no idea.
That sounds more like a,
No, yeah, I think so. Let me just say this. The ABC itself does not regulate either. You're not, no, we don't approve labels. We don't approve formulas. That's all TTB.
yeah, I was thinking that sounds more like a TTV type question then.
Right.
Can growlers for wine be refilled when a customer brings back the empty, or do we need to exchange a pre-filled one for the returned container?
You can fill it because you're the manufacturer. The only thing you have to do is you have to seal it when it leaves. That seal can be anything from a cork to secured foil wrapping, but you can refill them at your winery. Yes.
And
In
this
fact, that's an emerging trend. There's a Dupo 2 down the street from me, and they only sell their wine now in refillable growlers.
yeah, I've seen more and more of that these days.
Yes.
And this might also not be one that you would answer, but maybe, to what extent do grape growers have to keep records in terms of lots of grapes and harvesting or harvest dates and locations, and for what purpose?
I apologize. I'm not sure about the details of them. There's a wine grape growers report you have to submit to the ABC, but that really only relates, primarily relates to volume and for excise tax purposes, and for the amount of fees you have to pay, because the more grapes you're producing and fermenting, the higher your licensing fee with the ABC is.
All right. Well, I think we're going to stop there. It's 10:35. We are just on time. We're going to take a 5-minute break and we'll come back at 10:40. I want to thank Jacob. Thank you very much for joining us. Always learn something when I hear you speak. And Mary as well. Thank you very much. And we'll be back here at 10:40 and we'll hear from Andrew Sommer. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
All right. Hi, Karen.
Hey there. We're almost ready to start. Do you want to, let's see. All right, welcome back, everyone. Now just a little after 10:40. Our next speaker is Andrew Sommer. He's a partner with Conn Maciel and Carey, and he works mainly in the labor and employment, OSHA, and workplace safety groups. He has an undergraduate degree from the University of California, Berkeley. Got his law degree from the University of San Francisco School of Law. And he advises employers on a wide range of employment-related issues and defends employers in administrative proceedings, arbitration, and litigation at both the state and federal level. And we're really happy to have him here today. Thank you very much for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you, Karen, for inviting me to participate. This is a great seminar, and I'm learning a lot from hearing the other speakers. I'm going to cover the Cal/OSHA standards impacting the wine industry. I am historically a employment litigation attorney, and over the years I've developed a specialty as well in Cal/OSHA enforcement. My first experience with an OSHA matter ever was early on in my career when I was representing a large winery in a wrongful termination lawsuit where the employee was claiming all sorts of whistleblowing activity around diatomaceous earth in the filtering process, the use of respirators and fit testing, and I knew nothing about what they were claiming. And so I had a quick introduction to OSHA, and it was specifically in the wine industry. And then later on, I developed a more extensive expertise in this area. But what I'm doing today is, we have limited time, and I'm going to cover just the key standards that I found have impacted the wine industry that are frequently cited against wineries. And so we're going to discuss first the frequently cited standards. And that is, we have heat illness prevention standard, hazardous communication standard, confined space entry and respiratory protection. What I didn't realize when I was drafting this was that all of these standards require a written program document. And these are the types of program documents that are going to be requested of you if there is an inspection by Cal/OSHA. And at the outset, most of you I expect, are familiar with Cal/OSHA. They're pretty active with wineries and vineyards and agriculture generally. But it's important to note that there are 3 different agencies that are sort of sister agencies. There is DOSH, which is the Division of Labor Standards Enforcement. I'm sorry, it's DOSH, that's in the labor context, which is Division of Occupational Safety and Health. And they are the enforcement agency typically. And so they would be the one coming out to inspect you and to ultimately issue citations. There's also the Cal/OSHA Standards Board that issues regulations and standards. And then there's the Cal/OSHA Appeals Board that would hear any appeal that you may file as an employer from a citation that issues. And so it's important to note that Cal/OSHA seems like this obscure area where you might get a fine, a penalty, and it might be not all that much in certain circumstances, so you can just maybe ignore it. But that's not a good practice, because there are several just very kind of global concerns that you should all have from a Cal/OSHA standpoint. Is one that if you have a number of Cal/OSHA citations issued against you, there is reputational harm that could impact your business, your brand. Also, there's a prospect of having a repeat or willful violation. And a repeat violation is if you have multiple violations that are similar or the same. And every time you have a repeat violation, it's basically kind of mars your record, but it also increases the penalties that could be assessed. And then lastly, you may have business relationships where the business may discontinue that relationship based on your safety record as reflected from the Cal/OSHA citation. So those are all considerations at the outset I wanted to mention. So we're going to cover these 4 commonly cited existing Cal OSHA standards, and then there are 2 newish standards that I wanted to review with you. One is wildfire smoke. I know you're all very much familiar with that in California. And then there's also the new Cal OSHA COVID-19 emergency temporary rule. So let's just dive in here, given our limited time. Okay, so the first standard is outdoor heat illness prevention. And all of you should have a heat illness prevention document, as well as training for your employees. And just to be very clear, this heat illness standard applies to all outdoor places of employment. The Cal OSHA is working on an indoor heat illness standard that's kind of been mired in the bureaucracy. We'll see when that ultimately issues. I would expect it to issue in some form at some point. This standard will apply to your operations if you have employees working outside. Also, there are a variety of different requirements over training and the content of the program. It's also important to note that there are high heat requirements that apply, where the temperature is 95 degrees or above, or otherwise in agriculture, or the transportation and delivery of agricultural products that may apply to you. And so again, you need to have written procedures. This should be a document that complies to a T with the regulation, and this will be something that will be requested from a Cal OSHA compliance officer when they come out to inspect you. And then really the core requirements for heat illness prevention are to train all your employees and supervisors. There's a myriad of different requirements for training, and they're very specific. And I have kind of litigated these where we've had to show that we've complied with the various different elements. So there's a number of different factors. It's around, knowledge of heat illness, identifying the symptoms of heat illness, what measures should be taken when an employee does show signs of heat illness, whether that be first aid, medical treatment, calling for kind of emergency support or rescue. And then there's some additional requirements for training of supervisors that relate to the responsibilities specifically of the supervisor. And then many of you are familiar with the requirements generally for heat illness that relate to providing a sufficient quantity of fresh water to employees, and that you are required to provide access to shade. And that's when the temperature is above 80 degrees. And you also need to encourage employees to take cool down recovery periods, which we'll get to, I think, on the next slide. So for the cool down recovery periods, that is a requirement. It's fairly amorphous in the regulation, and it's been a bit frustrating for employers because you really don't know exactly when you're supposed to provide this, more than generally, and how often. And theoretically, you could be required to provide this constantly throughout the day. But the standard is essentially a 5-minute cool down rest period when the employee feels a need for that break to protect him or herself from overheating. And so it's very important that you have a policy that's distributed to employees, that they understand that they're entitled to this, that you cover this issue as well in your training of employees. And a really kind of significant issue from a wage and hour standpoint is if you do not provide a cool down recovery period, it can be treated like a failure to provide a meal or rest break, and there can be an entitlement to premium pay, essentially additional compensation for each day in which this cool down rest period is not provided. So there can be very steep penalties or essentially wage premiums that can be assessed. So there are many elements to the heat illness prevention standard, and this is just a general overview. And we have so many different standards to apply that to discuss today that this is going to be a relatively brief discussion. And then the next standard is the hazard communication standard. I think we can just cover this in a nutshell fairly briefly. But you have different chemical substances in your workplace that will trigger requirements to disclose those substances to your employees and make sure that you have safety data sheets for those chemicals in your workplace, and that they're properly drafted and available to your workers. Now, this disclosure is specific to hazardous chemicals to which employees may be exposed. And that would be various different substances. We do list them here, and looking at what the hazard could be, it could be anything from a simple asphyxiant or any kind of substance that could be absorbed into the skin, could be breathed in, things like that. And for your industry, really the areas that are pertinent are, spraying of grapes with pesticides. So that is largely regulated by the EPA. And then anything relating to the facilitating of the fermentation and filtration process in winemaking. And specifically, I think of my experience from years ago with diatomaceous earth that has silica in it. And that would be something that would also fall under this hazard communication standard. Also, cleaning barrels with sulfur dioxide, that would be a situation that would trigger the standard. And then cleaning storage equipment with caustic cleaners. And so you are required to maintain a hazard communication program document, and you're required to explain what chemicals are in the workplace to which employees may be exposed, and specifically to list them out. There's also requirements for container labeling, having safety data sheets, and these are sheets that would typically be provided by the manufacturer of the product. There are circumstances where you may have your own process in-house where you don't have a safety data sheet and you need to develop your own, and there's very specific requirements for what must be on that sheet. Then there's also training requirements for training your employees about these hazardous chemicals and what information is available to them. And again, you list out these chemicals known to be present in the workplace. And lastly, there's a requirement that you provide ready access to the safety data sheets. And so you'll want to have a booklet or some other compilation of the safety data sheets and a list of the chemicals in the workplace that are available to employees. So you don't want to have this buried in a drawer in a supervisor's office, ideally in a location that employees know where it is and that they can access it should they have any questions. Okay, so moving to confined space entry. This is another area of great concern in the wine industry, given the winemaking process. And so this standard, as I mentioned before, also requires that you have a written program document. And I've seen employers cited under the standard for not using all of the verbiage under the regulation. And so my huge takeaway for all of these different standards is where there is a program document that's required, make sure you're looking at the actual regulation, whether you're working in concert with a safety professional to ensure that all of the required elements of the standard are incorporated. And for the confined space entry standard, you're required to develop and implement policies and safeguards for conducting training if employees work with permit required confined spaces. And so a confined space is essentially an area in which an employee could fit his or her body. And for permit required confined spaces, we're looking at spaces like that where there are hazards, dangers to employees from a hazardous atmosphere based on the gases or other substances in the air. It could also be because of the risk of asphyxiation, engulfment, where you just can't get out of the space. Maybe there could be a collapsing of the walls. And so for your industry, we're really looking at tanks or vessels. There's probably other items too that I just can't even think about right now. But it's where, it could be where there's a potential for low oxygen or for harmful gases that might be in the air. So just like with the other standards, you're required to have a written confined space entry program. And then there's this permit process that many of you are familiar with, that requires that you complete the permit before the employee enters that confined space. And so you have this process where you have an entrant that goes into the confined space, and then you have the attendant who is essentially standing by and completing the permit. And the importance of the permit is to ensure that there's an evaluation of the confined space before the entrant goes into that space. And so you're monitoring the air. If it's a tanker vessel, for example, you'd be monitoring the air for oxygen levels, for other hazardous substances. And there is a requirement to continue the monitoring of that area as appropriate. Because there are circumstances where we've had in the industry, employees have had serious illness or a fatality because of the lack of oxygen or other harmful substances in that space. And so the importance of the attendant is that person can monitor the area and also ensure that there's appropriate rescue operations as necessary. Okay, so that is the very brief summary of confined space entry. And a related subject is respiratory protection. That is required for entering tanks, vessels, or vats where there is an atmospheric hazard, and that could be gases or dust, other substances. It is recommended that you have an industrial hygienist survey your workplace and determine where employees should be required to wear respirators in the operations. It's fairly nuanced, and this is a fairly detailed standard that there's a number of different scenarios, and you really need a safety professional to do this assessment. You are required to develop a written respiratory protection program. And there's an important distinction under the respiratory protection standard, just like there is under the wildfire smoke standard, between mandatory and voluntary respirator use. Many employers are loath to have or be in a situation where they have mandatory respirator use because of all of the requirements that are attendant to that. That includes an employee having a medical evaluation and there being fit testing with other specific requirements under the standard. But where the respirator use is voluntary, there's essentially a disclosure an appendix document that's provided to that employee. And there is a medical evaluation process, but you don't have to go through the onerous fit testing requirement. But this will really be a question of evaluating your workplace and determining whether the respirator use must be mandatory or voluntary. Okay, so I'm breezing through the initial standards because I really want to spend some time discussing the wildfire smoke and the COVID-19 standards. Those are new. Those are having a very significant new impact on your industry. And the wildfire smoke standard, that has been an emergency standard. The idea is that will become a permanent standard. Our firm formed an employer coalition, and we spoke at the advisory committee where they were considering changes to that standard. And we also submitted very detailed comments. I know that standard well as a result, and it is frustrating, particularly for your industry. And the greatest consternation by employers is over the requirement that you use N95 respirators in certain circumstances, and there's just been a lack of them, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll discuss with you just the general kind of application of this rule. And it essentially, the standard applies where the current air quality index for PM 2.5 and PM 2.5 is specific to wildfire smoke, and it's where it's 151 or greater. And just as an example, let me just refer to the different thresholds for air quality so you get a sense. And many of you during wildfire season, I assume, have looked this up for forecasting. But 151 to 200 is considered unhealthy air. 201 to 300 is very unhealthy. 301 to 500 is hazardous. So if you're over 500, it's very harmful air quality. And so the threshold is 151. It's a fairly low threshold during wildfire season. The other requirement for the application of this rule is not just that you reach the 151 plus threshold, but that the employer reasonably anticipates that employees may be exposed to wildfire smoke. Ask me what that means. I don't know. It's very vague. We've encouraged the Standards Board to clarify that. But what I can discuss with you is more succinctly are the various different exceptions. And so obviously if an employee is working outdoors where you have a range that's 151 plus, then the rule gets triggered. The exceptions are where you have enclosed buildings or vehicles. But those have to be buildings or vehicles where the doors are kept closed. So except for entry, exiting of those the structures or vehicles. So if you have a warehouse where you have a door that's just kept open, then the wildfire smoke standard would potentially apply. The other exception is if the employer can demonstrate that the concentration of PM 2.5 in the air does not exceed the thresholds by measuring the levels of air at the work site itself. And then a really important other exception is if employees are exposed to air quality at this air quality index for 1 hour or less in a shift. So if it's just incidental and they're just going out for an hour or less during the entire shift outside in air that exceeds those thresholds, then that employee is not subject to that standard. So that's important consideration as you structure the workplace. Now, the standard requires employers to take measures to protect employees who may be exposed to wildfire smoke, assuming the standard is triggered. So the employer is required to monitor the air quality. It's not exactly clear at what thresholds the employer is expected to do that. But the employer can review the current and forecasted air quality through the different sites, such as the EPA site, or it can conduct its own monitoring. You just need to make sure that you conduct that air monitoring of your workplace consistent with the Appendix A to this standard. And so there's two important thresholds, particularly related to respirator use, and that's if it's 151 or greater for air quality, or if the air quality is above 500. And then you have an obligation to communicate to your employees wildfire smoke hazards, particularly the air quality index as it applies, and then conduct training and instruction for employees using the Appendix B that's attached to the standard. And so if you're in an area where you expect that there could be a wildfire in California, that's quite a number of areas, it's important that before wildfire season that you conduct the required training and instructions for your employees and that you document that training, of course. Now, requirements for reducing harmful exposures. And so just like with respiratory protection, there's this hierarchy of controls. And so you start with the engineering controls where feasible. So you look at ways that you can restructure the workplace to minimize exposure. And engineering would be things like improving the filtering of air. You can have different structural changes in the configurations, perhaps ensuring that you can close warehouse doors so there's not air that can actually enter. And then another consideration would be administrative controls. That's where engineering controls do not sufficiently reduce exposure. And administrative controls would be like relocating work to areas where the air quality index is lower. And that, so if you can relocate employees to a different location, that's likely not feasible in your industry, or it could be changing work schedules such that if the air quality is poor one day, potentially not having employees work that day, work another day, reduce the intensity of work, provide more breaks. But then the one area that's a bit challenging, that's triggered by different thresholds of the air quality index, relate to respirator use. And by respirator use, we're really talking about N95 respirators. We have really lobbied Cal OSHA to recognize alternatives to that N95 respirators, given the dearth of such respirators during the pandemic. We have not received any guidance by Cal OSHA. There has been some guidance by Fed OSHA. And so for now, the only recognized device would be the N95 respirators or a powered respirator, which is quite costly. And it's important to note that that respirator can be reused as long as it maintains its structural integrity and it can be cleaned. But there are two very significant targets here. One is that if you are above 151 in the air quality index, you must encourage use of respirators on a voluntary basis. And in that situation, employees can decide that they don't want to use the N95 respirator. But where you exceed 500, which is a pretty high threshold, then respirator use is required. The problem there is that if you're going to require respirator use, then you have to go through the respiratory protection requirements that I just addressed, which would require fit testing, medical evaluation. And if you haven't done that already, then you can't essentially operate under those circumstances. So you'll want to ensure that you have contingencies in place. And if the air quality does reach 500, do you decide just to close down operations at that point? Or do you have employees wearing N95 respirators? If so, then you need to make sure you've conducted the proper medical evaluation and fit testing process in advance. So these are all really challenging issues. We're hoping there'll be some further clarity as this rule continues to be revised. Just like much of the emergency regulations by Cal OSHA, they have lots of ambiguities, lack of clarity, and items that really haven't been tested to the extent that they can be properly implemented by employers. And so there's been a bit of an outcry, to put it lightly, to the standard. So, and lastly, going to address the COVID-19 emergency temporary standard. This is a standard that was just passed the end of November. It hasn't been in effect very long. It is about 23, 25 pages long. It is a onerous standard. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic is very serious and measures are important. But what happened here was, in the rush to get this passed, the agency did not solicit feedback from industry or stakeholders. And so there were a number of issues with this standard where items simply just were not intelligible or could not be followed. And so there has been this follow-up process of an advisory committee to elicit feedback from stakeholders. I have been serving on that advisory committee. It's a group of about 30 individuals from industry, employer side, as well as from health and safety, such as the California Department of Public Health officials. And so we have provided feedback, and there is a revised draft, and there may be further revised drafts in the future. So I will speak to the current iteration of this. This is a standard already in effect and something that can be enforced by Cal OSHA. In fact, COVID cases right now are considered a high priority, and they're being enforced right now over many other cases. So if you, my takeaway would be to ensure that you understand the guidance in this rule, that you have a standard, and that you are, to the best of your ability, on high alert to the extent that you could readily have an inspection by Cal OSHA under the standard. So this is standard, unlike many other standards, it's very broad. It applies to all employers. So it's not, even if you only have 2 employees, it could apply to you. It doesn't apply where you have employees that are working from home, essentially teleworking, or don't have contact with others in the workplace. That's unlikely to be the case for your workers, particularly those that are in the workplace. And there's also a carve out for essentially healthcare workplaces where they are subject to the aerosol transmittable diseases standard, which would not be applicable to you all. And it's a really important notation in the standard is that this ETS is not intended to limit more protective or stringent state or local health department mandates or guidance. So I would recommend that you be abreast on any healthcare orders or directives from your local health department in your county, as well as under the ETS. And so there is a requirement, it's similar to the Injury and Illness Prevention Program standard. It's a performance-based standard in most respects, and there's a requirement to establish, implement, and maintain an effective written COVID-19 prevention program. And so just like the IIPP, there's a requirement that you have various different elements relating to communication, investigating incidents, investigating sources of infection, correcting hazards, training. And so some of these elements were already recommended by Cal OSHA before the standard took effect. Now we just have a much more kind of robust set of requirements that are spelled out in this emergency regulation. And so there are some very important notice requirements. If you do have a COVID-19 exposure, meaning that you have a COVID-19 case or positive case in your workplace, and there's been a close contact of that person, you're required to provide notice to that employee who's a close contact and that employee's union, as well as independent contractors and other employers who might be close contacts. There's also another, a piece of legislation, Assembly Bill 685, that has its own notice requirements that are much broader. There are some proposed changes presently to this emergency standard that are designed to make this compatible with Assembly Bill 685, and that would be giving notice to a general work site that would go far beyond close contacts. It's fairly involved. And then there's also a requirement for free COVID-19 testing, and that has to be on paid time. So if it's in the workplace during working hours, that would be paid time while they're working. If they have to go off-site, you need to pay for their time out of work for that testing, as well as any travel-related costs for transportation, as an example. And then you're required to exclude any COVID-19 cases, any positive cases from the workplace, and any employees that have been close contacts, essentially potentially exposed by those individuals. And then you'll need to investigate and determine workplace-related factors that may have contributed to the COVID-19 case. And there's some really important reasons for doing this. You want to determine whether you need to record this case on your OSHA log. And if it's not work-related, you do not need to record it, but that's an assessment you need to do very carefully. That assessment also affects whether you need to pay wages and benefits while the employee is being excluded from work, and whether, if there is hospitalization or fatality that's COVID-related, whether that case needs to be reported to Cal OSHA. So that's a really important process. And then there's some requirements for distancing and face coverings. Indoors, ensuring that employees are separated by at least 6 feet, except where the employer can demonstrate that 6 feet of separation is not possible. Now, what does not possible mean? That's not a word that's typically reflected in regulations or statutes, and we have lobbied to have that, or advocated to have that corrected to use a word such as reasonably practicable or feasible here. And then there's also a requirement that employees wear face coverings and that they obviously have to be worn over the nose and mouth. Okay, and then just like with the respiratory protection standard, there are engineering and administrative controls. And those are required where the employee cannot maintain 6 feet of distancing. So there's a requirement to have, specifically to have solid partitions in this circumstances. And that's specifically to where there is a workstation where an employee does not have easy movement. So that could be the situation of a receptionist, a cashier, someone attending to the public where they're fixed in one location. There are also requirements related to mechanical and natural ventilation. And so there is, based on the science, a requirement to maximize the quantity of outside air to the extent feasible. Of course, that becomes a problem where it is hot or very cold and you want to have the HVAC on, or if the air quality is poor, such as in a wildfire smoke situation. So there is an exception recognized for those circumstances. And then there's also cleaning and disinfecting procedures. Those are fairly straightforward about disinfecting frequently the touch surfaces and shared objects. And there's a recommendation to for employees not to share objects to the extent feasible. So, okay, so this is an area that I've heard the most concerns from management on, and it's related to paid benefits and continuation. And so there is a requirement to maintain earnings and benefits while an employee is excluded from work. And that's because they're positive for COVID, they're a COVID case, or they're a close contact to someone that's a positive case. And in that situation, an employer is required to continue paying benefits if the employee is able to and available to work. And so in a situation where they might not be able and available to work is that they're too sick to work. So this is really focused mostly on the situation where you have someone who is a close contact who, out of caution and protection for other workers, that they're being excluded during that period. Now, an employer may use the employee's sick leave benefits or consider public benefits to offset this. But it's really important to know, and this is another area where it's really tripping up employers, is that it's not as easy as it appears in the ETS because of wage and hour considerations. An employer cannot require an employee to use paid sick leave for an absence. It has to be done essentially with the employee's consent. So if you are going to apply the paid sick leave benefits to cover this expense, I would encourage you to obtain the employee's consent and somehow record that in some form in your records. Another exception is if an employer can demonstrate that COVID-19 exposure was not work-related, then that COVID case does not need to be paid these wage continuation benefits. That essentially requires you to document, conduct a work-relatedness assessment to determine what the sources are of exposure in and outside of the workplace. And that would essentially involve interviewing the employee and conducting any related investigation. Okay, so regarding the return to work criteria, the exclusion from the workplace varies depending on whether it's a COVID case or it's a close contact. If it's a COVID case, meaning a positive case, if that person has symptoms, they need to be excluded for at least 10 days since the onset of the symptoms, and at least 24 hours after they had a fever of 100.4 and above, and after that fever has been resolved, and after COVID-19 symptoms have improved. If it's a positive case without symptoms or asymptomatic, then they can't return until 10 days after the date that the positive test specimen was collected. And then for a COVID-19 exposure or close contact, they may not return for 10 days following the exposure. And we've tried to get that 10-day frame to be narrowed, particularly for critical infrastructure jobs, but for now, that's the standard that we are dealing with. Now, there's another really important related standard. It relates to outbreaks, and I really can't get into all the details with the limited time today, but essentially, if you have 3 or more COVID cases, positive cases in exposed workplace within a 14-day period, that could be considered an outbreak, or the local health department could deem your workplace an outbreak. And if it's an outbreak, then you're required to comply with certain elements here. And the exposed workplace is as indicated, as a term of art. You're really focused on the areas that where the COVID cases are present, and they all have to be present in the same area. So if you have different work areas and these 3 or more cases do not overlap, then that would not be considered an exposed workplace collectively to trigger the outbreak provision. It's a really tricky analysis. I suggest consulting with counsel before deeming the workplace an outbreak, because once it becomes an outbreak, you're required to go through what seems to be an endless cycle of testing. So you must continue to comply with the outbreak requirements unless there are no new COVID cases in the exposed workplace for a 14-day period. But we're hoping that Cal OSHA will update this and make this a bit more realistic, because this essentially is such a high standard that you could just be in this outbreak mode for a significant period. And this was the case during Thanksgiving and Christmas, where so many employees were coming to work, tested positive with COVID. It was clear it was not spread in the workplace. And nonetheless, it was considered an outbreak potentially, and the employer was required to comply with these requirements. There's a difference between outbreak and major outbreak, and there's some additional requirements for major outbreak that unfortunately we can't get to today. And so for the testing requirements, this is really important. You must provide testing with pay to all employees at the exposed workplace. And again, that's a subset of the workplace. It's not going to be the whole workplace or even one building. It can be one area of the facility potentially with the right analysis. Testing must be free, and then you conduct this testing once, then you're required to conduct the test again in another week, and then you continue this testing weekly until there's no new COVID-19 cases within a 14-day period. So this can be quite costly if you're administering this on site, given the cost of having someone come on site. If it's off site, then you have the additional cost of paying employees for their time away from work while they're being tested. Okay, and then there's some requirements for outbreak notification, and that's to the local Department of Public Health. There are a number of complexities over that. The local Department of Public Health, they had some different interpretations around outbreak than Cal OSHA, but in a nutshell, this is some of the information that you're required to share with them. Karen might be telling me that I'm getting close to the end, so I will. So I will not share this information with you right now. You'll have a copy of the slides and you can read it. And then really lastly, there are some rules under this ETS for employer provided housing and transportation. And that could be a whole nother presentation, but if you do provide a housing to your employees, you'll be required to ensure certain controls are in place, and they're quite detailed. And then if you have a shuttle to work or transportation within the workplace to employees, for example, if they're going from your main building out to the vineyards and you're driving them out there, your mode of transportation has to comply with this standard. And so we have a more detailed webinar on the ETS, the COVID-19 standard, that's on our website. So you can go there. There's also a bunch of information from our COVID-19 task force, and you can see that all here. And we have blogs where this information is available. But if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Yeah, there are some. We have time for, I think, a few. Someone asked about, did they understand that shade is required at or above 80 degrees Fahrenheit? And I don't know if you know that off the top of your head, or I'll have to look back at that slide.
It is, you know, and these regulations are so detailed, you could easily ask me a question I wouldn't know the answer to. I'd have to go look to the standard. But I do recall that for the shade requirement under the heat illness standard, it does write in there that the temperature has to be, I believe, it's either at 80 or above 80 degrees. So it's in those circumstances that you'd have to have shade.
Right. And then the next question here has to do with if a winery has a permanent employee who works off-site, such as at a ranch, does a copy of all protocols need to be kept at the ranch, or is the copy that's at the winery sufficient as long as the employee is aware of the standards?
It may depend on the standard at issue. Most of the standards do not need to be maintained at a specific location. The idea is that they are made available to employees upon request. And so at a minimum, you'll want to have that at your offices where your, or your headquarters, your main location where employees may report and that employees can request those documents. And it's also important to have those so if Cal OSHA shows up, you can provide those to them in an inspection. But I don't think I can answer that in detail today because it may depend on the individual standard at issue.
Okay. Is the advisory committee evaluating how vaccines or vaccinated employees can be taken into consideration in the ETS? And actually the next question is similar, talking about whether these COVID-19 regulations will be updated. And they talked about how we've learned a lot about the virus. And this person also asked, once vaccines are widely available, to what extent will employers be required to protect employees / customers who've chosen, oh, this one has to be not to be vaccinated. Okay. So the first one is evaluating how vaccines and vaccinated employees can be taken into consideration. And then the next one has to do with protecting, I guess, employees / customers, et cetera.
Well, this is one of my favorite subjects. This was a lively discussion at the advisory committee. And there was some thought about, from Dosh about what to do if, when the workforce is fully vaccinated and whether to carve out some sort of complete exemption or partial exemption. That's just not a realistic benchmark because you're never going to have a 100% vaccinated workplace. Employees have the right to seek accommodations, and that can be for disabilities where they cannot be vaccinated, or it could be for religious reasons. And so it's very unlikely you're going to have a fully vaccinated workforce. But in an individual context, there are many circumstances in which there should be exceptions made for vaccinated employees, and that could be around testing. Just like if you just test positive for COVID, there's not a reason to get a test again. You shouldn't be required to test someone just after they were vaccinated for COVID-19. There's also a question if someone who was vaccinated is a close contact with a positive case, do they need to be excluded from work? I would argue they shouldn't be. And so the real question is, and this is the struggle, is how effective are the vaccines related to transmission? And then how for what period of time could they be effective? And so right now there is guidance from CDC that's been adopted by the California Department of Public Health, recognizing a 90-day period following vaccination. Where I think where there doesn't need to be a requirement to quarantine the vaccinated employee following exposure, but the science is evolving, and so there's really an apprehension by Cal OSHA to write in a very clear exception at this point. Cal OSHA does not, under this legal framework, we're not allowed to just defer to agency guidance generally, which if it's CDC, I'm more comfortable with it. I'm not so sure I want to just defer to California guidance, just wholesale, but we can't do that. So the problem is that we can't just generally defer to this agency guidance because that would be an underground regulation. So the only recourse there is really to have something that's really written in stone. And there's a proposal that our coalition has made, which is essentially to offer that if the vaccine is at least 70% effective, generally, that there is no requirement to test or to quarantine in the determination of the California Department of Health, Public Health as to the efficacy. So it would give some discretion for the agency to determine that it is effective, since the manufacturers, as far as I know, are not promoting the efficacy.
There are 4 more questions, and we're now about 5 minutes behind. So if I could ask you to maybe answer some of these, you can type the answers into the Q&A, Andrew, so that we can move on to the next presentation. Thank you very much. That was really informative. I learned a lot. And obviously there's a lot of regulations in there. It's a constantly evolving work in progress, right?
No, it is. It's complex, and if there's any further questions, the participants can certainly shoot me an email. I'd be happy to respond that way too.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Next, we have Linda Harris coming up next, and she is going to talk about the Food Safety and Modernization Act and its application to wine grapes and making wine. She is a UC Cooperative Extension Specialist in Food Safety and Microbiology, and she's also the current chair of the Department of Food Science and Technology at UC Davis. She has a bachelor's degree in food science from the University of Alberta and also a master's degree from the same university. And then she received her PhD in microbiology from North Carolina State University. It's interesting that she notes that her work at North Carolina State, she had the opportunity to work in the pickle lab, studying the microbiology of sauerkraut. I thought that was really cool. Her first academic position after graduation was at the University of Guelph in Canada. And then in her second position that she took in the 1990s was here at UC, she joined the faculty here at UC Davis. Her research focuses on microbial food safety of fresh fruits and vegetables and tree nuts. And one of the things, the reason why we asked her to be here today is that more recently she has focused on and become very well versed in the requirements of the Food Safety and Modernization Act. And like I said, that's what she's going to be speaking about today. And thank you, Linda, very much for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Just checking, you can see my slide, right? Not
Yes.
not the speaker notes.
Nope, it's your slide.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So I want to say you've heard my introduction. I am not a lawyer, but I have done a lot of work with the food industry on training related to the Food Safety Modernization Act. I also did spend a year at FDA in Maryland in the CFSAN, the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, and they are the group that develops the policy around the Food Safety Modernization Act. So I did that right in the time when they were in the process of rulemaking, and so I have some experience from that side of it, and I've done a lot of research that has been applicable to various aspects of these regulations for the food industry. So the Food Safety Modernization Act was passed in 2011, and that required this list of regulations to be passed with a goal of modernizing food safety in a national American regulations, and with a focus on prevention rather than a more reactive approach to food safety issues. So today I'm going to focus on only two of these, the two that I think are most relevant to growing grapes and making wine. And the first is the produce safety rule. And you'll see here that it applies not only to grape growers, but also hop growers. And so I've presented this in the context of the brewing industry as well. And almost everything that I'm going to say today pertaining to grapes and wine also pertains to hops and to beer. So the second is the preventive controls for human food. And this is the part that applies to wineries and breweries. So the produce safety rule, 21 CFR 112, 21 for Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And this was a brand new area for FDA to get into. Previously, the Food and Drug Administration really only dealt with products after they were harvested, and often, a little bit further downstream than a packing house. And so this really brought into their regulatory sphere not only packing houses, but actually farms that grow produce. And so that was a huge difference for FDA. There are requirements for training if you fall under this rule. And so you have to have somebody within your organization who has been to a recognized training. And the Produce Safety Alliance, which is housed at Cornell University, has a recognized training program. It's about an 8-hour training. It is offered in person, or since the pandemic, it is available online in an online format. So that is something that the individual who goes to that training gets a certificate that's registered, and it stays with that individual as they move from job to job. So the key requirements for covered produce, and we'll talk about what covered produce is in a second, are listed here. So agricultural water, biological soil amendments of animal origin. So really we're talking about manure-based amendments. Sprouts are talking about, there's a separate section just for sprouts, and that is sprouted seeds. They have their own separate kind of part of this regulation. Then there are things around domestic and wild animals, an important section on worker health and hygiene and requirements for training. Things related to equipment and maintenance and sanitation of equipment and tools and buildings. And then specific requirements for record keeping. So this is only applying to covered produce. And again, I'll get to that in a second. The rule is really focused, it's food safety, but it's focused on biological hazards. So there really isn't much in the rule that pertains to chemical hazards. And there isn't much in the rule that pertains to physical hazards. So most of those things on that list that I mentioned are because the focus is on those vehicles, those items being vehicles for microorganisms that cause disease. And so I've listed some of them here, everything from bacteria, Salmonella, E. coli, and Listeria, parasites such as Cyclospora, or viruses like norovirus. And the reason for this is that since the mid-1990s, produce has increasingly been recognized as a major contributor of foodborne illness. These organisms listed here and others. And so this was this rule was a direct result of multiple outbreaks related to consumption of fresh produce. So produce is defined as fruits or vegetables that includes mushrooms and sprouts. And even though traditionally tree nuts and peanuts have not been considered produce, for the purposes of this rule, they are in. So they are considered covered produce. Not covered, so grains are outside of this, and you'll see that within that grains, there's some things like sunflower seeds, which you could say, well, that's kind of like a peanut, but it's in a different category. So anything on the lower half of this slide is outside of the produce safety rule, and so would not be a covered produce item. Covered produce encompasses what we call raw agricultural commodities. So within that list of fruits and vegetables, there's 98 specific vegetables. And I put grapes in there. So just to bring that out, grapes would be considered a fruit or vegetable that is under covered produce. It's also lists categorical, so citrus, which of course would include grapefruit and kumquats and mandarin oranges and lemons and everything else. And then things like fruit baskets, but it's all about intact whole fruits or vegetables. It includes domestically grown and products that are imported into the United States. So, as was mentioned earlier today, whenever there's a rule, there are a bunch of exemptions, and this is important to you as winemakers because there's an exemption for wine grapes that I'll get to in a second. There is a list of produce that is rarely consumed raw, and that's an exhaustive list, meaning that you have to be on the list to be exempted from that list or from that exemption. Produce that is not a raw agriculture commodity, and then produce that is destined for commercial processing. So one could argue that wine grapes are, not consumed raw when they're made into wine, and you could argue that wine grapes are not a raw agricultural commodity when they're made into wine. But where you ultimately fit is actually in the destined for commercial processing. So I'm not going to read through this list. You'll have the slides, but there are 34 items on this list. And in the last year, FDA has reached out to the industry for additions to this list, realizing or recognizing that they may have failed to include some things that should have been on this list that were minor crops. And so that this list is expected to change slightly in the next year or two, but grapes would not be one of the items that would be expected to end up on this list. Raw agricultural commodities, a RAC, means a food that's in its intact state. So an apple, a whole apple, is a raw agricultural commodity. Sliced apples are not RACs. Green beans are a RAC. Frozen green beans are not. Pomegranates are a RAC, but if you buy a container of the arils, that is a processed food. And so it doesn't mean that the apples grown for apple slices wouldn't have to be grown under the produce safety rule, but they would be, that would be part of the apple slicer facility to put into their food safety plans, and it would be their responsibility to ensure that the apples that they're purchasing for their products are grown in a manner that's appropriate for that particular product. And then finally, this commercial processing exemption. As it was originally written, there was specific documentation required and annual written assurances required. So this is an example, in Northern California, we grow a lot of tomatoes that end up in a can. And all of those organisms that I indicated on as biological hazards would be eliminated in the canning process. So tomatoes, processing tomatoes would be exempt from the rule because they're going to a commercial process that is known to adequately address those types of microorganisms. But there was this requirement for documentation, and that's where things kind of, there was some pushback on those requirements and exactly how that would be set up, especially when you had complicated industries and growers, the product flowing in multiple different ways throughout the system. It became more complicated than was originally imagined when the rule was written. And that led to a few attempts at fixing those parts of that part of the rule, and some explanations for what FDA was thinking for those particular requirements. And there was specific industries that actually requested some guidance in this area. And that included hops, wine grapes, pulse crops, and almonds. And so in March of 2019, this guidance document was published, which is an enforcement policy document. And essentially, this explains their thinking. And the bottom line was that they recognize that there's evidence, lots of evidence, that winemaking achieves that goal of adequately reducing the presence of microorganisms of public health significance. In this case, through a means other than cooking. So the combination of pH and alcohol and the fermentation process itself all achieves those goals. So in this document, they are stating that they recognize that. And they are considering pursuing rulemaking that would address this circumstance. So that hasn't happened yet, but in the meantime, they are using something called enforcement discretion, which essentially means that they do not expect wine grape growers to follow the produce safety rule, including having to prove that you are under a commercial processing exemption. So this means, you know, as it says here, do not expect these commodities to meet the produce safety regulation requirements. So there is a caveat in this, and that is, like, I don't think it's terribly common, but it's something you need to watch out for. And that is, you cannot decide that, you know, most of your grapes are going to wine, but you're going to sell some of them because you have a niche market for certain varieties of grapes that you're going to sell just as whole grapes. That would mean that you are selling table grapes, essentially, or grapes to be consumed as a raw agricultural commodity. And they would not have been produced under the produce safety rule because you are using this commercial processing exemption. And that would mean that they could be deemed adulterated. And adulterated means, you know, that they could be prepared, packed, or held under insanitary conditions. And that would mean, that would be, you know, the kind of the verbiage used in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to say, you know what, you didn't pay attention to the produce safety rule, you didn't grow these grapes under that rule, therefore they might be contaminated with pathogens of public health significance, and we're going to consider those specific grapes adulterated. But as long as you're not doing that, as long as all your grapes are going into wine, then you're covered under this exemption. Okay, so that's grapes. I'm going to move now into the making wine and the wineries. And so this comes under the preventive controls for human food, which is CFR 117. Again, there is a training for this regulation. It's a little more extensive training. And this is the Illinois Institute of Technology houses the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance that has the recognized standardized curriculum for this particular regulation. It is a 2.5 to 3 day course. And it is something that would be required for somebody who is, managing the food safety program, developing the food safety program within the facility. So again, exemptions. There are exemptions for wineries that would fall under a retail food establishment. So if you are making your own wine and you're selling all of it directly to consumers, then you're considered under the retail food establishment, and you wouldn't be considered to be under CFR 117. So wineries or breweries who are in meet and who are exempt from some of the provisions of this rule meet two requirements. One is that you're registered with the FDA, and this is section 415 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And you have to register initially. So when you start up a winery, and then every 2 years, and it's usually, well, not usually, it is even years. So 2020 was the last time that we had the regular re-registration, and that's it takes place between October and December. And so there's just a place you go online and fill out the information about your facility. And then you have to have a TTB permit. So, so those two conditions are met, and then you are, you're under the CFR 117, which has A to G provisions. But if you meet those two conditions, then some of these subparts are eliminated. So the ones in red are the ones that pertain to breweries and wineries. So subpart A is things like general provisions, definitions, qualifications, exemptions. So that's a really broad subpart. Subpart B is good manufacturing practices. And subpart F pertains to records that must be established and maintained under this regulation. So what is taken out of the requirements for breweries and wineries are a hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. And then there's some things on modified requirements and qualified facilities, which I think in general would have less, would not pertain under most circumstances, and a supply chain program as well. That said, there might be some reasons why you might want to look at subpart C, because as I said, yeah, the taking subpart C out of this hazard analysis, the assumption is that winemaking is going to deal with all the foodborne pathogens that might be present. But doing a hazard analysis, a proper hazard analysis, could help you identify chemical hazards, which are, taken into consideration if you're going to do a full-blown hazard analysis. So chemical, physical, and biological hazards. So there might be some good reason to go through that, although it would not be a requirement or an expectation if you were inspected by the FDA. And in California, chances are you would be inspected by the California Department of Public Health, which coordinates inspections of food processing facilities with the FDA. So just to look at some of the subpart A qualifications of individuals. This is individuals who manufacture, process, pack, or hold food. And this just basically says that your employees know what they're doing. You've trained them to do their job, and that you have records to document that you've trained them. And the key words here that I think, pertain from a food safety standpoint are with respect to cleanliness and safe food production. And then specifically it says that these employees will receive training on the principles of food hygiene and food safety that includes health and hygiene as appropriate to the food and the facility and the individual's assigned duties. So I would guess that for those who were transitioning into CFR 117, there might have been some minor things that needed to be tweaked in your training program, but I wouldn't have thought that there would be much different from what a winery was doing before this regulation was published. So under the subpart B, current good manufacturing practices, they're listed here. I'm not going to go into detail on any of them other than to say that these are the things that we have considered good manufacturing practices since the 1960s. So all of these items are things that people have paid attention to and have addressed over the years in making food in a safe manner. And a lot of what you do in wineries to make sure that the wine doesn't spoil or that you get a good fermentation, a reliable fermentation, depends on your ability to maintain sanitary operations, sanitary facilities. You should have processes and controls in place that to run your business. So a lot of this, again, is pretty standard to what you already do, and I think would have required just minor tweaking in order to comply with what the rule actually says. And then finally, subpart F is record keeping. In the food safety world, if you didn't write it down, if you don't have a record of it, it never happened. And so all food safety regulations have record keeping requirements. So this just lists all of those. Basically, I'm not going to go through them. There are requirements for how long you have to keep records, what kind that you have, which records you have to turn over for an inspector. All of those things are covered in this section. And you don't need the one that pertains to subpart C because you don't have to follow subpart C, which is the hazard analysis and the development of a food safety plan. So that's basically my overview, very high level overview. It's not getting into the details at all. I just wanted to point out that at our website, ucfoodsafety.ucdavis.edu, there is a section on processing and distribution. And if you hit that section, see a page that looks like this. It says product types. If you hit that section, you will be able to find the alcoholic beverages and the information, the regulations. You can scroll further down. I can't here because this is a screenshot, but there are all the links to the regulations and guidance documents that I spoke about today are all linked to here. So with that, I think I actually finished a little bit early, but I'm willing to answer questions if there are any, or we can go back to, oh, here we are. Okay, there are some.
The first question actually for you. Well, first of all, thank you very much. Always very informative. The first question is, what biological hazards exist in wine or beer? This was a question. Is produce safety a warranted concern for alcoholic beverages?
So I think I kind of covered that in that, there are data to show that the combination of pH, of alcohol, and the fermentation process that, essentially uses up readily available sugars and is kind of a competition of microorganisms, will kill the organisms that we are concerned with produce. So the salmonellas, the E. coli's, the viruses, there's data to show that that process, so you've got those components of alcohol, pH, and time actually. And all of those things together means that, the finished product in the bottle is not considered a risk for foodborne pathogens.
So along those similar lines, someone asking, might be jumping ahead, but what if a winery wants to bottle a little grape juice or verjus? Do the grapes lose the exemption rule?
So a little grape juice. So
That means no alcohol.
yeah, no alcohol. So yeah, that's probably, that's a larger question because there's a whole regulation just pertaining to juice. So I have to say that. And so that there are some nuances to that juice regulation that I can't get into because I don't have enough time. But so it would complicate things, I think, because the enforcement discretion document that I showed is an enforcement discretion document pertaining to wine grapes intended for wine. And so if you're unintending them, into something else, then I think, the specific circumstances of what exactly you're doing, because then what you're doing, you may have additional responsibilities. So it's a little bit complicated, but you can contact me if you have questions.
What you're saying is there's a separate set of regulations around juice.
Yeah, and other foods. So other foods. So
someone mentioned that a number of wineries also produce olive oil and honey as well. Does this change the regulation requirements for a winery?
So so honey, honey and olive oil are also have their own thing going on. I know it's kind of trying to get out. So, so you would have to register as a food processor, as a winery, and on those, as you register as a winery, you would also have to register as an olive oil processor and a honey processor. You may have to, if you're not selling those interstate, you may register with the state and only the state. So again, not a simple yes or no answer. So it's complicated and it depends. One of my favorite answers, but again, I could lead you to some of the, we have some good information on honey, and we have some great information on olive oil in our department. So if you have those going on, we can give you some information.
Okay. Someone mentioned or asked, is there an exception to FDA registration based on winery size? I think there used to be. I'm not sure if that still exists.
So, no, there is not. So there are some exemptions in the produce rule, but that on size, but that's not the winery. So, no, you would need to go and look at the registration specifically, but I don't believe that there's a size.
I think when this whole thing initially started and there were some exemptions for wineries, and I think there was sort of a tiered or timed.
There is a timed, so typically with these regulations, the big players have to comply first, and then the medium size, the smaller players comply second, and then the smallest players comply third. But everybody's on board now. Yeah, we're far enough down the regulation that everybody's on board.
That's what I remembered, is that early on there was that tiering, but I think we're beyond that at this point. Yeah.
Oh, we make non-alcoholic wine. So, yeah, I don't know much about the process for making non-alcoholic wine. I do know in the cannabis industry that they use a lot of de-alcoholized wine. So wine that has been made into wine and then the alcohol has been taken out. And if that's what you mean, then it's actually gone through winemaking and then something else. So I think, again, that's probably okay. If it's, I forgive me for not knowing how you would make a non-alcoholic wine. If it was more like a juice by a different name, you know what I mean? Then it would probably fall under the juice regulation, and the juice regulation would not be exempt from, it does subpart C, but in a different regulation, essentially.
Someone also asked, are yeast and yeast derivatives covered produce?
No. Yeast are not produce. And then the one question about smoke taint. I think we got the smoke taint expert on the
Hey, Anita,
on the line here.
Unmute.
Yes.
I do not know what the safety of smoke taint in wine is. Yeah.
So someone's asking, to what extent does smoke taint impact the safety of wine for consumption?
It does not impact the safety at all, because smoke taint is a quality impact, but it's not have no health issues related to that quality impact.
All right.
Well, thank you, Linda. I know that was like a lot of questions there at the end. There's a lot of details and exemptions and exceptions and everything. So these regulations are very specific.
Well, and I think we've seen the scope of regulations that people have to deal with today. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us.
Well, I would like to say thank you very much, everyone, for all the speakers. It's been very informative because probably this is my Achilles heel. And I was just, again, today reminded why I'm happy to be in academia and not have my own business, because it's extremely complicated and there's a lot of rules and regulations to follow. I understand the reasons why they exist, but it is daunting, and I can imagine it's daunting, and that we need a lot of clear guidance to be able to comply with all these rules and regulations and keep everybody safe and happy. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to extend once again a thank you to our extension partners. That's part of our partnership program that help us do these programs. These things cost a lot of money, unfortunately, and take a lot of people hours. I'm for free, so don't worry, none of this covers me. I'm paid by the state. And I would like to remind all of you of upcoming programs. So we actually have our recent Advances in Viticulture and Enology program, in short RAVE, on the 7th and 8th of April. That's the program where researchers really talk about the newest research they're doing in the labs, things that may not be published or not be known outside of the university. And in May, 12th, 13th of May, we're still figuring out 1 or 2 days, we will have another on-campus program focused on viticulture, specifically grapevine canopy management. And we have a few other things down the line, but I don't want to commit yet. We'll let you know as they materialize. Thank you, everyone, for spending your morning with us. It was great to virtually see everybody's names. Goodbye, and have a good day.
All the speakers as well that are still here, Linda and Mary, I see. Thank you guys for joining us today. We really appreciate your taking the time to inform the stakeholders.
And inform us. Thank you. And see, this is why me and Karen is a good team. She always remembers what I've forgotten. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.